Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Leader, CEO of All In Together. Welcome to the third Women in Financial Services Equity Forum, where we highlight how women are leading change and innovation across the financial services industry. For those of you who don't know us, All In Together is a nonpartisan, nonprofit women's civic education and mobilization organization. Since our founding in 2014, we have trained tens of thousands of women across America to be civic and community leaders, ensuring they have the tools and resources to speak up on behalf of themselves and their communities. Our financial services forums over the years have helped shine a light on the intersections of business and public policy and motivated the men and women who participated to take a greater role in fighting for a more equal financial industry and sector. Today, we will be covering some of the most critical issues facing the financial industry. We will look at how to break the last glass ceilings for women and people of color to ensure they reach the highest levels of leadership in the industry. We'll explore the funding gaps in venture capital, shining a light on how to access investment and capital and how that creates a more inclusive economy. We'll hear from two male CEOs who are using their power and position to drive change, and we'll learn from two of our nation's most innovative economic thinkers about the policy changes we will need to address growing inequality. It's going to be a powerful and thought-provoking program, so I hope you'll stay with us. One note, the full bios and social handles for our speakers are posted on the All In Together website for you to read in full. But we also encourage you to engage with us on Facebook or Twitter to learn more about our amazing speakers and to stay connected with the program. This program was made possible through sponsorship by a group of companies committed to advancing conversations like these. A special thank you to our platinum sponsors, Citi, Deloitte, State Street, and TPG. We are proud that Citi currently chairs the board of All In Together, and both State Street and Deloitte have served on the All In Together board for nearly 5 years. A huge thank you also to our gold sponsors, the D.E. Shaw Group, Lord Abbett, and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for making this event possible. Over the years, women have made amazing strides in nearly every field and discipline, out-earning men in the share of college degrees and breaking barriers. In the financial services industry, women have certainly come a long way over the last 30 years, and yet progress remains slow. And women remain seriously underrepresented on boards, in the executive teams of major financial institutions, and do not receive anything close to the same share of capital as men. Kicking off today's conversation are Mann, Global Chief Economist at Citi, and Donna Milrod, Executive Vice President and Head of the Global Asset Managers segment and Global Clients Division at State Street Corporation. They will talk with us about the remaining glass ceilings and what it will take to break through. Linda Quaranto, Human Capital Managing Director at Deloitte Consulting, will be moderating the conversation. Over to you, Linda.
Well, thank you, Lauren, and welcome both Donna and Catherine. I'm so pleased to be with you today and to moderate this important and really timely discussion. In my role at Deloitte, I've been lucky to work with many of the major banks on Wall Street throughout my career, and in particular serve both Citi and State Street. So again, I'm very pleased to be here. I did want to start with a question to both of you around what changes that you've seen as it relates to racial and gender representation through your careers. And Catherine, I'd like to start with you.
Well, thanks very much, Linda, for moderating this discussion, and to the Financial Services Forum for the overall panel and the complementary panels as well. You know, I have had several different careers as an economist. I've been at the Federal Reserve Board, I've been at think tanks, I've been an academic, a professor in academia, and now here in financial services. And you know, what I've found in all of those is that there is a decent representation of women that come in on a pipeline basis. About 30% of undergraduates take economics. And so that's kind of your pipeline into a financial industry or into academics as a professor or into the Federal Reserve, as an example. But then what we see at the top of the pyramid is something very different. You know, in academia, full professors, it's under 10%. In financial services, it's even less than that. If we talk about the top of the pyramid in financial services. And it's only actually was at the Federal Reserve where, and in my particular place in academia, Brandeis University, where we broke that model, where we actually did break the glass ceiling, and we had a higher proportion of women and a very high proportion of women at the highest level, a full professor at Brandeis. And the key was having women be role models, of course, but also be there with the Rolodex to say, you know, I have the person who will fit that slot. I have the person who will be the next MD. I have the person who will be the top of the pyramid. And that's critical. That's the first thing that is critical, is to have somebody at the top who's got the Rolodex, who has the names of people who are good fits. But you know, there's another challenge. That's sort of like an internal challenge. But the external challenge is, what do the customers want? Clients in financial services or students in academia. And in some cases, we find that the clients or the students have a very different view about women in high-level professional positions than they have of men in high-level professional positions. And so breaking the glass ceiling is not just about breaking it from the bottom up, but it's also about breaking it from the top down and getting the customers, whoever they might be, familiar and willing to interact with people who are not like them. Because it still is the case, most of the clients are men, and actually a lot of the students in economics are men as well.
Really interesting perspective, Catherine. Donna, I don't know if you want to add to that. I think that's really an interesting perspective about the clients. Anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I guess my background's obviously very different than Catherine's. I actually grew up on the sell side of the business, and I grew up on the trading floor, you know, many, many, many years ago. And there really were no women on the trading floor, and certainly no one of color. And if you look at kind of what a similar trading floor looks like today, it looks completely different. So I think we've made some strides, not a ton. And I'd say, Catherine, from my many years of recruiting, women actually came in at 50% off of undergrad campuses, at least into trading programs. And then systematically, year by year, as women got more senior, they would drop out for a variety of reasons. And so you'd see the paucity at the senior levels. And it's just getting better, but not nearly where it needs to be.
And to that end, you know, both of your organizations have really done a great job in getting 30% gender representation on your boards. Has that made a difference in what you're talking about, Donna, in, you know, being able to retain, you know, has there been an impact from that accomplishment?
Yeah, I mean, you can't say no, but I'd say 30% is like, you know, sorry for being sarcastic, but like, why are we celebrating 30% when we're over 50% of the population? So it all helps, but I think Catherine's point about role models and people who are actually willing to pull people up who look like them is really kind of the way to go. You know, it's so clear that implicit and explicit and implicit bias is really what's at work here. And until people actually use that for goodness, to really bring people up that look like them, you know, things will not change. It just is glacial pace.
Yeah. And then, Catherine, I guess a specific question to you is having, you know, the first female CEO, you know, shortly any day now of a major bank. Yeah. You know, what does that mean for everything that Donna has also just said about not just in Citi, but for women in financial services?
So, of course, it's a terrific breaking of the ceiling that Jane Fraser has done for the Wall Street financial institutions. And it really is representative, I think, of what Citi is trying to do. And they are very good on bringing women in. So recruitment is excellent. We clearly have a winner at the top. But as I say, there are these two challenges, the internal challenge of retention and promotion. That remains a challenge because there's an awful lot of I will promote the people who look like me, and most of them still are men. And then there's a challenge, as I say, on the external side is, who are the clients asking for? Who are the clients asking for, and who are the sales and the RMs offering? And a lot of times it's the same people who look like them. And so this sort of sense is an ecosystem issue that you can't just change internal to an organization to get to where we want to be, which is diversity and inclusion. And I have to say, on the diversity side, outside of the gender element, we're really terrible, generally speaking, as the industry. But we also have to have this external change and evolution to have a more diverse set of clients, representation on the client side as well, so that both of these are important in order to get to where we want to be.
And so from the client side, what do you think your roles in the industry can be to help that? Because I think you're right? I mean, your customers at the end of the day drive a lot of the business and what your objectives are. What do you think, or is there a role for the banks to play in helping that?
So I guess I'd start with, at least from a State Street point of view, our clients actually demand to be serviced by people who look very diverse and look very different. Part of that is because we, I think that the public funds, the official institutions, asset owners in general tend to hold themselves to a standard, and they, set metrics up and they meet them. And then they demand the same of their service providers. So we've actually felt that pretty acutely amongst our client base. And I'd say asset managers generally, with the rise of ESG and the kind of waking up to the social consciousness around what's happened over the past year, we've had more dialogue with clients on this topic about who we field or put in the field to service our clients and call on them, both from a sales and relationship management and a service point of view than we ever have before. So it feels like there's been a little bit of a crack in business as usual, and it's all for the better.
Catherine, anything you'd add on that?
Well, so I think that I agree that the realization and the transparency on both sides of a relationship, both sides of the client relationship, the sales and the other side. This is an important aspect of getting to more diversity on both sides of the equation. Metrics of performance, that's another place where thinking about a totality of a relationship is an important ingredient in thinking about what does it mean to get somebody to the promotion stage? How do you measure their success? And some of the metrics can be pretty narrowly defined. And so thinking more about what does a relationship really mean? And how do we measure that? I think that there's an element there that also would facilitate more diversity on both sides.
Mm-hmm. And, speaking of, what you said, Donna, about, I think taking a look recently about a more holistic picture, your organizations, as well as many other companies, not just on Wall Street, have made big commitments. So it's this summer for, stemming the tide of systemic racism. Do you think that this is sustainable? Is it, I heard a CEO the other day on Squawk Box talking, and I thought, where have you been for the last 10 years, right? So is this in your mind sustainable because the spotlight has been, lightened, if you will? And what more do you think Wall Street needs to do in that regard?
Well, first I'd say, where have you been the past 20 years? I mean, or longer even.
Right.
I feel like we've been fighting this fight for so long, and, I hear a lot of the ideas that are being offered, and they feel very similar, right? When we were trying to deal with gender inequality for as long as I've been working. It feels different, though, at the same time. And it feels different because I think the light is brighter. I think you're right, Linda. And, it feels like the people who are talking about it now are people who would really kind of sign on, but they weren't active or, really vested in an outcome. So it feels very different than it has for the time that I've been working in financial services, which, has been a really long time, but so it feels very different. It gives me great hope. Is it sustainable? I mean, it has to be. It just has to be. We
Agreed.
can't let this opportunity go.
Yeah, agreed. What about as you think about going forward, right? And the impact, particularly Catherine, I'd be interested in your opinion as an economist. The impact that COVID has had on women disproportionately, leaving the workforce, being more impacted, losing jobs at the lower levels. What do you think that again, giving this time, how do we stem that tide when we're trying to systemically impact racism at a deeper level?
So on the racism side, I do think that in response to that question, I mean, Citi has put together not only a report on sort of the numbers on how the consequences of racial gaps in income, housing, entrepreneurship, education. If we were to close those gaps going forward, we'd have $5 trillion of additional demand. So we have numbers behind it in terms of economic reports, but also, of course, Citi put into place an extensive commitment to additional funding to financial institutions to lend, particularly to small and medium-sized businesses and Black entrepreneurs, as well as to focus on housing. So Citi is putting a lot of money up on this challenge to try to deal with systemic racism from the standpoint of the economics and the finance. In other words, the role that it could play directly into the marketplace. On the issue about COVID and the disproportionate effect on women and people of color, it's absolutely the case that we have this consequence right now. Going forward, though, I think we have to address, it's not like these particular positions for women or people of color at certain job categories, they weren't great jobs to begin with. They were not earning a living wage. Many people were cobbling together 2 or 3 different jobs in order to get to something that represents a living wage. And so, this is where issues having to do with minimum wage legislation, currently a part of the Biden administration's program, thinking about broadly, how do you get people childcare? How do you get people school care? How do you get people transportation issues? So there's a range of topics that need to be addressed from the standpoint of once COVID is over, it's not like, things are bad now, but they weren't so great beforehand. So we want to do better after post-COVID. We don't want to just go back to where we were before with regard to both women and people of color disproportionately in jobs that are at the low end of the income spectrum. We don't want to go back to that. We want to do better than that.
Right. What do you think that our industry, the financial services industry, can do? So you're right about public policy and raising the minimum wage, but
Right.
what can Wall Street do to address some of those issues? When hopefully this is over and people can get reemployed. Are there job programs that you see Wall Street being able to support and things like that can actually make a difference?
I mean, I would say absolutely. I mean, there are many different jobs in Wall Street. We saw this when we started Women on Wall Street. We did the same point of view when we started the Veterans on Wall Street. There's everything from IT jobs to HR jobs to operational jobs, service roles. You don't all have to have like high degrees in finance to be successful within financial services. I'd also say that we're trying to make it clear to diverse populations of students from, starting as early as high school, that there's careers in asset management and financial services that could be quite interesting to them, that maybe they're not exposed to in the normal course. They don't see it other than like a retail bank. So I think that's the onus is on us to do that, to make it clear that there's a career path for people that may look different, and that we are warm and welcoming, and that you can have a wonderful career and really deal with those inequalities by kind of lifting themselves and others up into careers that are really sustainable, to have a more than just a living wage, to have actually a really nice career.
So I know we're almost at time. I want to ask you both, what are you most hopeful about for your industry and the opportunities for women and people of color in leadership roles? You know, again, we've all talked about this has been going on for a long time. What are you most hopeful about, and what do you think that looks like?
Well, I'll start maybe. There's two, there's many things I'm hopeful for, but I'd highlight two in particular. And they're really represented in, you may have heard about the Fearless Girl that we put on Wall Street 2 years ago. And I think that has just such a strong symbol of hope in general, about not only about women generally, but and women certainly in financial services, but just, kind of the underrepresented. So I think there's two. One is this conversation that we're having. I think it's different than I've ever experienced before. I think many people have said the same. And I'm hopeful that that conversation will lead to more conversations that is very open and, turning people who are, kind of in the majority into really good listeners about what's been happening in this country and around the world around racial inequality and economic inequality and gender inequality for a really long time. So I'm very hopeful about that. The second is what we're just talking about, these opportunities to reach into communities that are underserved, underrepresented, and show a way, show that kind of leadership, show those kinds of careers. And you don't have to have, advanced degrees, but they're great jobs for economic opportunity that leads to great outcomes. So I'm hopeful on both of those fronts.
Terrific. Catherine?
I would agree that the key issue here and the key change is not just transparency about what exactly does your recruiting, retention, promotion look like? What exactly do your salary data look like? Increasingly, companies can't hide behind the fact that nobody knows exactly what the numbers look like. So I'm an economist, right? So data are really important in shedding a light on performance and outcomes. So that is the first step. And there really is quite a bit more of a spotlight being shown on this now. And that means that, you're not going to be able to get away with having bad numbers so much anymore.
Yep. Well, I want to thank you both. We are at time. This has been really helpful, really insightful. And again, Donna, I couldn't agree with you more. We just need to keep this conversation going and not let, another 20 years slip by us. So thank you both. And Lauren, back to you.
Thank you all so much for that great discussion. Now from the corporate glass ceiling to funding and investment glass ceilings. We're pleased to welcome an incredible panel of women venture capitalists, all of whom are working to ensure women entrepreneurs get the funding and opportunities for growth they and their companies deserve. Shelly Kapoor-Collins, founding partner of the Shatter Fund, Jenny Abramson, founder and managing partner of Rethink Impact, and Ekpoudom, partner at GingerBread Capital, are all disrupting the venture capital status quo, and in the process, proving to investors everywhere just how smart it is to invest in women. Moderating the discussion is All In Together board member and Director of External Affairs and Government Relations for SoftBank Group, Tonya Williams. Tonya?
Great. Thanks, Lauren. I'm so excited to join this incredible forum and this panel of amazing women who are literally at the forefront of disrupting the funding ecosystem. They're changing the face of VC investing and the trajectory of women who are founding companies and underrepresented groups. So there's so much here that we can celebrate and talk about, but we only have 30 minutes. So I guess we'll just get started. And I think the best way to go is probably with some stats. So I'll give some of those and then we'll just run to questions, okay? Good. All right, so we've all been talking about the importance of diversity and inclusion for some time now, and there's tons of studies and mountains of research that consistently show that more inclusive teams get better results, and contributors, and they produce more innovative products, and that diversity significantly improves financial performance. The research also shows that historically, companies with female founders perform 66% better than those with male founders. However, women still get less than 3% of venture capital dollars. Sadly, as you know, that stat's even worse for women of color, less than 1%. Actually, one stat I see here is 0.06% of VC dollars, so really awful. And in fact, actually, when female founders do get funding, they oftentimes get less funding, which is than their male counterparts. And so, Shelly, I think I'll start with you on this one, and then we'll hear from the other panelists. Hoping that you can help us understand what's going on here and why, in the face of all this data, women, our funding numbers are basically the same in the same place they were 20 years ago. And why is it that you and the others believe that a fund that is exclusively for, dedicated to female entrepreneurs is a solution or part of the solution?
Thank you for that question, Tonya. And it's really great to be here with you and Jenny and Ida and to talk about this really important issue. I'm inspired, have been inspired by Jenny and Ida for a long time. So it's really great to be on the panel with you all. Back to your question, what I would say, you're 100% spot on. So women entrepreneurs, when there's a woman at the helm of a company or there's a diverse team in place, the returns are higher. By not investing in diverse founders, Morgan Stanley has put out research that VCs are leaving unrecognized gains up to 400 trillion on the table. That's not a small amount of money. So what's going on? Why aren't we funding these folks despite these staggering numbers? It's really a systemic issue. So if you look at the history of venture capital, VC has been innovating and funding companies for decades with white men who are at the helm of these companies. That homogenization of the investment sector has led to pattern recognition. It has led to a select few who are funding each other, hiring each other, and ultimately it's led to closed networks. And some experts would call this homophily, which means that similarity breeds connection, meaning that people give to each other who look like each other. And what that does, it cuts out women like me and my co-panelists and other founders who should have access to those networks, and those networks for access for capital and for markets and for the ability to get into new markets. So it's a systemic issue. Op-eds are not enough. Talk is not enough. The call to action is cash. And it's going to take more than, it's going to take some time to change, and we have some catching up to do.
I was just going to add that one of the interesting things, just to sort of echo what Shelly said, and just thrilled to be here with you guys. It was great to be with fellow believers, is that when a woman is in a venture capital position, she is in a partnership position twice as likely to invest in a female entrepreneur as her male counterparts. And so I think one of the most exciting opportunities for change is to change things in venture capital itself, because currently, about 67, almost 70% of all firms have no female partners at all. And so because of that, you end up seeing this sort of perpetuation of the cycle of men investing in men, making money and then becoming venture capitalists. So I think one of the best and most exciting opportunities for change is what you're seeing on this panel, which is lots of women and people of color actually coming into roles where they deploy capital because they're much more likely to invest in more diverse entrepreneurs.
And I would say, as a former Wall Street trader, to me, it's frankly an arbitrage. If we are 51% of the population, when I think about women from the standpoint of the US demographics, how can these numbers make sense? It's not that women aren't building companies. It's not that women aren't interested in investing. It has to be that, when you overlook an underserved population, there's opportunities to make outsized returns. And that's one of the things where we're all in this is for outsized returns. So when people say, oh, is this philanthropic? Is this social impact? we believe you can do well and do good at the same time, especially when you're going to a demographic or demographics that have been historically underrepresented and underfunded.
Absolutely, absolutely. I hear that often with specialized funds. Why? Is there something wrong? Are you, investing in a substandard class or something like that? And the truth of the matter is, it's just that they've been overlooked for reasons that you all laid out there. So I'm going to play devil's advocate just a little bit here, and because you all lead firms that exclusively invest in women, are we letting men off the hook here? At these firms that these big large firms with lots of capital, by focusing on females only, are we saying to them, okay, you don't have to worry about that, you should, we'll take care of it, and you just keep on doing what you've been doing?
By no means are we letting men off the hook. I think actually showing them the opportunity to make money in this way is the best way to move the needle. And on top of that, in 2019, there was actually more than a 30% increase from the previous year in the number of female partners added to venture funds. So while we still have a long way to go, I think there's been an incredible amount of pressure from groups from Allraise to others to say, you need to do this. And there's been pressure created by funds like ours existing, showing people there's a financial opportunity. So I think we have to be in this together with our male counterparts. And I think doing what we're doing is actually the opposite of letting them off the hook.
I agree with that. And I also think everything that Jenny just said. And I also think that, we still need male allies. And, whether you pick a different term or male allies as the term, men still need to be a part of the equation and opening those doors for female entrepreneurs. If I think of, the people that have opened doors for me, Franklin Templeton is our lead investor in the Shatter fund. I'm now a venture partner to them. I'm advising them on the emerging market of female entrepreneurship. Their CEO, Jennifer Johnson, is the one who led the investment into my fund. But there is a gentleman who runs the Franklin Venture Partners private investing arm, James Cross. He got the opportunity right away. He's the one that led the due diligence. And so I think that having men and women together is going to be really key to this. And I think back to what Jenny was saying, when there is a woman involved in the investment decision-making process, a female entrepreneur is 2.5 times more likely to get that capital that she needs. But then again, that still happens when women are getting the opportunities to be a part of the investment making decision.
Absolutely. And I also think that we bring our networks from where we came from before into this. And when we think about our portfolio, we have a lot of the companies, we don't lead rounds, we co-invest. And one of the things we found is that a lot of the major existing players love coming to us when they have women in their portfolio, or if we send some of our earlier ones onto some of the bigger existing players in the space. And so for us, we're happy to say, okay, if you want to say there's a pipeline problem, or you want to say you can't find them, let us come look at our portfolio. Let us guide you, point you. We have peers in the space that are also doing this. So we find that we are getting male outreach, and firms that may have maybe one female partner or very few reaching out to us to co-invest. And that's really exciting for us, because the more we get women getting past the seed round, past the A round, into the B, C, later growth stage, that's when we know it's success, because at those points it just becomes metric driven. How well is the company doing? And less about in the early stage, oh, do I see the potential of this founder, which can get gendered or can get, that's when things get a little fuzzy. And so when you have a path to say, here's a pipeline, here's a pool, come with us, and we're happy to make those introductions along the way. That's how we work alongside our male allies.
I love the fire that came when I asked that question. You guys are ready. That is definitely not the
excited about this.
We don't feel strongly or anything.
Not at all. Not at all. So, well, you guys are doing amazing work, and obviously, your approach is working, and it is bringing amazing founders to accelerating their growth and putting them in a place where they can succeed, where they may not have otherwise had a chance, and that's all that folks are looking for there. So, well, let me ask you. Recently there's been lots of awareness. You guys are raising funds. I know Rethink just this year, in the middle of a pandemic, closed on 182 million, I think it
Yeah,
was your
about
second
180
fund?
million. We got lucky.
Right. Somebody tells
Not
me
luck.
not luck
We're
at
really
all.
good.
Not at all. I don't believe it at all. But this last year has been really interesting. We've had in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, we had lots of protests. We had corporations coming and pledging to do better in areas of diversity and inclusion. We had VC firms like mine, like SoftBank, that created special purpose funds to address the lack of the inequity in funding. And we seem to have a lot of momentum. Newly elected administration. We've got a female vice president who is Black and Southeast Asian, Shelly as well. We've got women leading the departments of Treasury, Commerce, and the SBA. We seem to be on fire. There seems to be lots of momentum. And yet this past year, we actually saw diversity in VC decline. So curious to get you all's thoughts. Should we be alarmed? What's going on there? And I guess it'd be great to hear from you guys just a little bit about what you think we can do or is most important to do to keep the momentum going.
I do think women have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic in the world that we're all talking about in this conversation. The data actually shows investment in women by VCs is as low as it's been since 2017, despite the fact that venture capital dollars overall did not go down during the pandemic. Venture investment actually stayed just as high. So I think that's deeply troubling. I think it has to do with a couple main things. I think one is women have taken a disproportionate amount of caregiving role during the pandemic. You can see the stats, it's astounding, the percentage increase of women who take 25 hours or more during the pandemic versus male counterparts. But I think the second and potentially bigger issue has to do with the fact that venture has always been a fairly insular business. People fund people that they know in their networks. And one of the things we've all been working to do is broaden that ecosystem. And the pandemic just brought people inside, brought people to fund people they already knew. And I think that disproportionately affected women, put more money in companies they already had. That said, I'm actually pretty optimistic, not just because of the global things you talked about, but because I think COVID showed people that there's a lot of things we used to think venture capitalists and entrepreneurs had to do in person that they can do by Zoom. And that goes as far as happy hours and board meetings. And I think a lot of women had taken themselves out of this profession in this world because they thought it had to be a choice. And I think the pandemic has showed people there's opportunity. And so I think when you couple that with the incredible amount of support that investors have given funds like ours and others, I think this is sort of a turning point, and that the ecosystem will start to change. So I think while there's been this lull that came in the moments of COVID, I think COVID is also going to lead to some positive things coming out of it, and for women in particular.
Right. Yeah. Although I want happy hour to go back to the bar. So just
that and sushi lunches for me.
So,
but
yes, but everything else you said, absolutely.
So it's funny, I'm following up to what Jenny is saying. At the onset of COVID, my team and I made a decision that we would not let COVID deter us, and we would follow up on our word. So, for example, when California was shut down, we had maybe 3 or 4 investments that we were actively looking at, and we followed through on those investments. We didn't use COVID as an excuse to hoard our cash or to not keep our word. So we made those investments, and it was probably one of the best decisions that we've made in terms of the companies that we put our money into, women-led and founded, of course. The other thing we did was we did a survey of about around 100 women-led founded companies across the U.S. to see what their number one disruptive factor has been during COVID, and it turned out to be childcare. When women were carrying the burden of childcare, carrying housework, and as a result of that, more women have gotten out of the workforce during the pandemic. And so that needs to change. And so while we took a step back to your point, Tonya, I still feel really optimistic because when I see the diversity initiatives by Apple, when I see the diversity initiatives by PayPal, what I'm really encouraged by is the fact that they're not just saying we're investing now, they're making 5 to 10 year commitments. So that commitment is here to stay. So I'd like to see that systemic change start to happen. And it starts actually with those big companies, and it actually starts with companies like Franklin Templeton that are also putting their money where their mouth is.
And for us, I mean, we, for all change, it begins at home, and it begins in the places where you can control. And from the standpoint of work, GingerBread, we were actually always a remote team. So I'm based in New York. Linnea and our associate is based in California. And then our other teams are in Maryland and Boston. So we've always been remotely distributed. So for us, when actually COVID happened and everybody went to Zoom, there was no disruption from the standpoint of how we as a team interacted. One of the things that we did pause was, as with everybody, was just thinking, where's the world going right now? What's happening? And so we spent time, talking with our existing companies and, providing support to those we had. But then we saw the opportunity to be very opportunistic in this moment and started making more investments. And we think we got to make some really incredible investments that we might not in a pre-COVID world maybe have gotten a look at. And so given that opportunity, we definitely took some leaps in that space. And then the other thing we've done is from the standpoint of doing direct investments in female-founded companies, we also feel that it's very important on the GP side, on the funder side. So we at GingerBread are LPs we just did 18 funds, and all but 2 are female GP-led funds. And so for us, it's important that we are helping capital go into the hands of those writing the checks. And some of them are dedicated to backing female founders, but not all of them. Because we want to show, whether it's in our direct investments or in our fund investments, that women can and are creating and investing in a broad range of outcomes, and that it's not just pigeonholed in one thing, because that is not what women are. We're not just one thing. And when you think about any group, they're not just a homogenous kind of being. So for us, it's important to control what we can control. And that's how we kind of approach this time to keep things moving.
The industry itself is overwhelmingly white. It's overwhelmingly men. Most of the investors and people in leadership have Ivy League, degrees. Nothing wrong with that. I went to UNC Chapel Hill, though, so I always like to say that, like, public schools, like, we've got smart people too, and it's largely been centered around Silicon Valley, which is something that's changing as well. We've seen people saying, "Hey, I don't necessarily want to live there. I can't afford to live there. I'd like to live somewhere else. I'd like to live closer to home." Lots of different things, and people are doing it. One thing that the pandemic has shown us, as you were speaking about as well. So, thinking about looking at you all, right? You all are incredibly accomplished, and you all had careers before you became investors, full-time investors. And I'm just thinking about, how do we, generate interest from women and girls, even, young girls, about, the pathway to being an investor, to venture capital. It's not, I'm an actual government affairs person in my day job, as well as working with the Opportunity Fund to do external outreach. And, as I think back, venture capital wasn't really a thing that anyone talked about when I was a kid. You could be a fireman, a doctor, a teacher, a lawyer. I'm a lawyer, recovering. Thank you very much. But, so, maybe you guys can tell us, what would you say to encourage, not just only to encourage, but to help women who are interested, either, at this point in their career, they want to, look into or, get into the venture capital world, or even parents that want to, expose their, girls to this and, in the path. It doesn't seem to be a linear one. No one kind of walks out of college and becomes a venture capital investor. So I guess if you guys could just shed a little light on that, that would be great, I think, for folks to know and understand.
Sure, I'll start. I mean, I think, well, let's be clear. I was born in Nigeria. I'm a classic immigrant story. And if my parents had their way, you would be talking to Dr. Ekpoudom right now. Deeply disappointing to them when I dropped pre-med. So growing up, the thought of being a VC never crossed my mind. My father was a professor at Hampton University of finance and economics, but it was a purely academic exercise. Even when I went, my first job out of college was at Goldman Sachs. And even when I went to Wall Street, I think I surprised them in that path, because it was one of those kinds of things where going into business in that way isn't like an immigrant path in the US. It's you kind of either do something very technical in nature that you'll have a job in forever. But like thinking about those paths are different. And so from my point of view, I feel like I started out where I want our companies today to end. And it's really important that I was able to start out in that world, working those kind of hours, learning that kind of skill set, because from there, not only did I build an amazing network, I now work with a former Goldman partner. We didn't know each other at the time, but that ecosystem of joining a very well-known organization helped in the fact of how we ultimately came together. It was a former fellow partner of hers who said, oh, you're looking to hire a partner, you should reach out to Ida. She's also an ex-Goldman person. So when those networks, the power of networks and the power of being able to get into the rooms with others is so important. And once I've gotten here, we've gotten such outreach from Black women, whether it's women that are founders or women that are thinking of doing other funds. So being here opens the eyes and opens the possibility for others to say, what is this? How did you do it? And as you said, mine was a circuitous path, but learning about these things along the way is part of the thing. And having guy friends who did these things and who talked about it also opened my eyes, because that's who I went to when I was thinking through the structure and all of these kind of things. I went to my male peers who were founders of VC funds or private equity senior leaders. And that's where I got the information, because I didn't have the female network in that space per se.
All right, male allies again. We need you to step up on childcare and on mentorship in the venture capital world. Shelly and Jenny, we're running close to time here, but I'd just love to hear your thoughts on this and any advice you might have.
I mean, I'll just say that, you know, my path, like you just said, Tonya, it was definitely not linear into venture capital, but the basic foundation of my path is I have a degree in information systems, a master's in information and in systems, and where that all stems from is my dad. I grew up in a conservative Indian household. He's an engineer, but that wasn't enough. Got his MBA at Ann Arbor. So it was really clear that either I can be a doctor, I can be a lawyer, or I can be an engineer, and anything less than that is just not going to cut it. So, but along the way, you have to figure out your path. And so, we did Oracle for 10 years, went into political tech. And really, I think the turning point came for me when I was appointed to President Obama's Council for Women in Business in the SBA. And, that's where I really got to understand, what are the most prohibitive factors for women to start businesses? I mean, I developed products and I self-funded them, but, maybe I was just in a silo, and I realized that it's not just me. There's a whole ecosystem of women out there who don't have that opportunity. So came out of the administration, and it was pretty clear to me that the pathway to starting to kind of fulfill our call to action and invest in women was to start a fund. And that's how I ended up here. And then back to Ida's point, it's all about the network. I used my network, and I really, brought the people in who trusted in me, like Jenny Johnson, like Karen King of Silver Lake. And then don't get me wrong, there were women along the way who, made commitments and didn't follow through on them. And that's okay. That's their path. But the point is, you follow your path. It may not be linear. You don't take no for an answer. And in terms of institutionalizing, like what you're asking, how do we institutionalize this path? It has to be deliberate. I mean, it starts with us. We have to put something in place, and we have to open the door, right? We can't kick the ladder for other women. So we have to be those door openers and not gatekeepers.
I'll go quickly. I actually came at this not from the investment background. I was an entrepreneur. I, after business school, actually worked as an entrepreneur in a big company, and then at a startup running an impact business that was dealing with sexual assaults and school shootings through mobile technology on college campuses. And what I quickly realized was that businesses that had a positive impact, not only did it not hurt their returns, it could help their returns. But I was struck by how often I was the only woman in a room. And I sort of wondered, where did all my Stanford peers and HBI, all the things that had seemed like it was gender neutral, where had everyone gone? And when I looked up the data and saw the numbers you talked about at the beginning, I was struck by how little had changed. My own mom had actually been in venture capital. So unlike most people, that did seem like a normal path to me. She had invested only in women before it was a thing people did. And what struck me was that the numbers were worse than when she was doing it 20 years earlier. And so I sort of had this moment where I thought, I'm not sure I can change this as a CEO. We need to move capital here. And in particular, where we at Rethink Impact invest is where companies are going from about $1 million in revenue to $100 million in revenue. So really helping them scale up in later stage, which is sort of of why we did the bigger fund. So, my advice to women would be, you can go at this through finance, which is an amazing path that Ita and many others have done. You also can go at this through the entrepreneur path, and both are great and both add value. And so that's to the extent that's helpful, I think both are important in the picture.
Well, this has been great. It went by way too quick. We could talk for hours. I for one am so glad to have you all at the helm, leading the way and bringing people up and bringing partners into this effort as well. It feels, like I said before, like we're on a good path, and I'm optimistic, and especially with the likes of you all blazing the trail. I know that we're going to continue to grow and to diversify the sector and continue to fund more incredible women with incredible products and services. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you. And I think all of us are reachable on Twitter and other things. So if we can be helpful to the audience of people today, I know that we're excited to help connect people.
Just like a woman. Always helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies, so much for that. Everyone everywhere should hear what you have to say. As a reminder, the full bios for all of our speakers are posted on the All In Together website, and be sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter to learn more. Now to a different perspective, that of the CEO. In recent years, many male executives have committed time, energy, and resources to advancing diversity and inclusion, both in their own organizations and in the ecosystems they're connected to. The two leaders we're about to hear from have impressed me with the seriousness of their commitment and their willingness to listen and learn from others along the way. I do want to note that while All In Together focuses on amplifying women's voices, for this discussion, we thought it was critical to hear from the men, especially given the fact that almost every financial services firm in the industry today is led by them. Both Doug Sieg, managing partner of Lord Abbett, and John Winkelried, CEO of TPG, have spent considerable energy and time over a number of years looking at how they can most effectively use their positions of power and influence for good. Joining them to discuss the role of CEOs in advancing equity in the financial services industry is our friend, Fast Company Editor-in-Chief, Stephanie Mehta. Stephanie.
Thank you, Lauren. I'm so delighted to be helming this conversation today on the CEO perspective on making change. And as you know, we're joined by two amazing leaders. Doug Sieg is the managing partner of Lord Abbett and Company, a private investment management company based in New Jersey, and he's a 24-year veteran of the company. And John Winkelried is the co-chief executive officer and a partner at TPG, which is a global investment firm with some $85 billion in assets under management. And prior to joining TPG in 2015, he was president and co-COO of Goldman Sachs. Doug and John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wanted to start by talking about the evolving role of the CEO. We have seen over the course of the last several years a real shift in the way that employees, customers, other stakeholders really look to the CEO. Doug, I'll start with you. You're a newer CEO or newer managing partner. You became managing partner in 2019, and I know at Lord Abbett, that's essentially the equivalent of a CEO. As you've spent 24 years in the organization, how have you seen the top job at Lord Abbett change during your tenure? And what are you bringing to the role?
Sure. I think I think fundamentally first, the role of the CEO shifted during the global financial crisis. And I think it shifted from, sort of the imperial CEO from that standpoint to what I would call the servant leader. I think the bond between the CEO and the youngest and newest employee just, became, there's no distance between. And I think that the challenge in this pandemic has even accentuated that further. And I think that any CEO has to realize, or any leader in the organization has to realize that they're there to make the environment better for their people. They're there to put them in a world where they can succeed, they can win, and people have the opportunity to judge that day in and day out. I'm particularly interested post the pandemic. I really think the role of leadership will shift as well. I think when you think about some of the core competencies of driving vision and purpose become incredibly important around stakeholder capitalism. I think, really attracting and motivating and inspiring talent will be very different. And I think I think courage is another competency that's going to be tremendously important. The willingness to speak your voice in this environment is so needed from that standpoint. So I think it'll continue to evolve, continue to shift, but the primary purpose, I think, of the CEO will be to act, with empathy, to act with compassion, to understand. And certainly there's no difference between work-life balance. We're all in each other's homes now from that standpoint. So I think it's going to be very different coming out of this pandemic as well.
John, I'd ask the same question of you. What's the evolution of the role of the CEO? And for you at TPG, how have you had to change your priorities in the last 5 or 6 years as CEO of the organization?
Well, I think a lot of the points that Doug made resonate with me. So just to pick up on some of that, I think that the nature of running a business like this, I think now also demands that people who work for us across the entire firm are really interested in understanding not only what our business priorities are, but also really want to be in touch with the values of the organization. What do we stand for as an organization? They want us to touch things beyond just really the investing business that we run. I feel like the CEO role, therefore, has to really be just more holistic in terms of how we think about the problems that we are talking about, the issues that we're talking about. I also feel like communication has gotten a lot more important. This dynamic that Doug was describing, which is essentially kind of a flattening of the organization, is very tangible now, in the sense that people want visibility into what are the leaders thinking. What are the leaders thinking? What are they working on? How are they approaching problems? So the way you communicate what you're doing as a CEO, as a leader, how the leadership team communicates what it's doing and what it's thinking. There's almost a different need in my mind today, or an imperative for like what I think of as kind of a cascading of information, which is, make sure that the leadership group is informed, make sure that that they are then doing the same thing that I'm doing as a leader in terms of communicating with the team. And again, it's more holistic. I give you an example. We start off our week every week with what we call Firm Forum, and Jim Coulter and I lead Firm Forum at 8 o'clock on a Monday, and the entire firm dials into it. And we talk about a range of different things. We might be talking about a really interesting company that is part of our portfolio, and we might be talking about Black Lives Matter. We might be talking about social justice. We might be talking about, we introduce our new hires on that call. So this kind of connectivity and kind of what I would describe as a little bit more of kind of the intimacy with respect to people want to feel about the company they work for, I think demands slightly different things of a CEO today.
Well, since you raised the specter of social justice and racial justice, I'd love to dig in a little bit to the subject of inclusion and equity. John, I know that TPG has been playing a really active role in getting your portfolio companies, so the companies in which you're an investor, to really think about the diversity of their boards. And I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that initiative, and specifically how you've been able to gain a little bit of leverage, because in a lot of the cases, you're not a majority stakeholder in those companies. You may be a minority investor, and yet you've been able to initiate this conversation and get real results. Tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that we've been consciously doing is really thinking about the firm in a more comprehensive way. What I mean by that is a more inclusive way. What I mean by that is that TPG's got a little over 1,000 employees. When you look at the broader ecosystem that we think of as the firm, it involves over 160 portfolio companies all around the world, and then of course all those companies have significant numbers of employees. So the broader ecosystem, it's a very large ecosystem. It's got a lot of reach. And I think the thing that we felt that was important is that we believe our portfolio in some respects is a reflection on us, right? I mean, we're investing in companies that we believe in. And so as a result of that, what we try to do is we try to bring to our portfolio not only what I would call sort of the day-to-day value creation capabilities and initiatives, which are vital to creating appropriate financial returns, but we're also trying to bring to them what we think are other important perspectives on what's happening around us all. How are we responding to things like, as an example, take the racial justice or social justice movement. I think we felt it was very important to be communicating with our portfolio about how we're thinking about it, what are we saying to our employees, and it's important that we're not trying to dictate or direct or demand in any way, shape, or form how our portfolio companies are responding. We feel like we have an obligation, and it's important for us to share with them, though, how we think about them, because we're important partners. Whether or not we're a control investor, whether we're a minority investor, we're important stakeholders, and we're important partners. We view ourselves as capital partners, but broader than that, we view ourselves as partners with our portfolio. Most of our CEOs get it, right? They understand that they need to be progressive in this respect. They need to be thinking more broadly about this, and they need to have a board, a governing body sitting around that, really sort of embraces and represents the broader customer base that they serve, their employee base. So we've added over 100 women to our boards. It's been an incredible addition of talent, frankly. We've got more work to do because we've now expanded that initiative to a broader definition of inclusivity and diversity. And so we're now going back around for sort of a second time, thinking about how does other forms of diversity express themselves across our board. So that's how we've been thinking about it.
And Doug, you've been working hard on the subject of inclusion internally at Lord Abbett. Can you talk about some of the initiatives that you've launched to help women, people of color, the LGBTQ community? And we can start with employees, and then we can talk a little bit about how you're also working to attract new talent from diverse groups to the company.
Sure, and John, that's great to hear on the the adding 100 women to board. I mean, just absolutely, I applaud you from here. When I took over, this was not a topic that any of my predecessors really wanted to talk about as much. And when I took over in 2018, we really wanted to start a journey, and we wanted to start a journey around a number of different areas. First was community involvement. We had to recognize that our people care about our community. They care about the local community. We care about families. We care about people around them. We had to start to express that, sort of start on one journey. The second really was around ESG. We felt a lot of our investors feel passionate about ESG as individuals, but we were having a hard time having that translate into portfolios in a sort of a clear and concise manner. And then third was really diversity and inclusion. I mean, every organization, particularly in financial services, has work to do there. And we know that. But what we tried to keep saying to ourselves, and we hired our first ever head of diversity and inclusion, what we try to say is, let's become a more inclusive environment first. Let's really understand what it means to bring your whole self to work. Let's understand what it means to change policies. And we really had a renaissance at Lord Abbett. We moved from a very, we're a 90-year-old organization. And, we had, you can imagine the number of rules that were developed over those 90 years. We said, let's throw away the rule book. Let's focus on being a principles-based organization. We have a highly educated, highly motivated, hardworking workforce. Let's let them do their job, and let's shift from if they don't like it, they can leave, to our job is to make sure that they're operating in an environment of peak performance. Let's get rid of office hours. Let's get rid of vacations We don't even count vacations. Let's provide free healthcare so we can make sure our population's healthy and strong. Let's embrace, a more relaxed working environment. Let's embrace work from home. Let's embrace a lot of the other things that sort of shift that environment. And sure enough, once we became a more inclusive environment, and that has been, nothing but accelerated during COVID, you realized right away that we're going to attract a lot more talent. And I realized how hard this environment has been, particularly on working mothers who, have to take care of a family at home. But I am very optimistic on the other side that this is going to allow us to attract talent we've never had before. I was on like John, we do a town halls every Friday, and I talk to every employee, and it's sort of the same thing. It's a lot more intimate as a leader. My kids come in, they need me to fix the printer or something is broken on remote learning, as always does. But I think just creating a new environment, allow people to work in a more relaxed manner. I never have to worry about how hard people work at Lord Abbett. They're very dedicated, and that is translated. And I think what's interesting about the environment, and John touched on it as well, from a portfolio standpoint. Look, ESG really was more about climate prior to the pandemic. I mean, that was really the lead, and bang, all of a sudden, governance became critically important, and all of a sudden social has become incredibly important, and you have to use your voice. After the George Floyd, it was the first time I think anybody as CEO of Lord Abbett sent out a note to the firm and saying, I'm outraged by what I saw. We formed Black community, networks, women networks that are talking in a symphony chat room all day, just sort of integrating with each other. So we still have a lot of work to do. There's no doubt about it. It's a journey, but we're on the journey. And the thing about that journey is it's got to be paved by authenticity. It's got to be paved the right way, and it's got to be paved in an inclusive manner. And so I'm excited about what we've done. And even on ESG with our portfolios, we are engaging. We supported heavily. We wrote a letter to the SEC in support of NASDAQ and their requirements on board seats. So we'll continue to get strong and use our voice, and we'll be a better organization. I'll just end with, we all know it. A more diverse team's a better team. We don't need to debate that anymore. And I think as CEO, understanding that, how you create the environment and how you set the temperature in the room is so critical. If you want to set it on an inclusive, diverse workforce that works together, works hard, and operates in an environment of psychological safety, you can do it, and it'll make you a better organization going forward.
Doug, how do you think that these internal efforts will pay dividends for the business as you try to perhaps attract a broader pool of investors, as you try to make financial inclusion and investing available to a broader pool of Americans? Do you feel like some of the work that you're doing internally is going to help you, whether it's be more credible when it comes to providing ESG investment opportunities for your clients, or just making you a more attractive partner to a broader set of investors?
Absolutely. I am a capitalist, but I believe in stakeholder capitalism, not just one shareholder capitalism. And I think when you think about stakeholder capitalism, it's important for the whole community to win. And we talk a lot about family. I say every day, we are in a people business, and the strength of our firm is people, and the strength of our people is family. And it was very interesting. From day one, we really started to invest in communities, in all sorts of things to make the environment better for our people. And over a short period of time, one of the things I said when I took over is we have to become the best place to work in asset management. That's our goal. That's my intent. That's what I want us to be. And in 2.5 years, we were able to, for the first year, got on Pension Investment's list of best places to work in asset management. That translates to talent. People want to come to where there's talent. We are growing as an organization. We've averaged, in an industry that's struggling to find growth, we just topped over $230 billion and have grown on average over 8% a year organically. We're up, almost 10 billion in net flows, fiscal year to date. And when you can grow and you can demonstrate you can grow, and when you can be a great place to work and recognize as a great place to work, you find more talent. And when more talent comes, that's just better for our investors. You bring in better knowledge, you bring in different asset classes, different ideas, more global thinking, and I think it makes us better, as investors for the investors that we serve, because ultimately this is, line our industry up, and 10 years from now, it's going to be either we got stronger and better in our people talent, or we didn't. And if we get stronger every day and we get better people here, we will remain independent, we will continue to grow, and we will continue to serve clients well.
John, I'm going to close out by asking you to talk a little bit about the role that TPG's core business can play in advancing equality in the world. As you said earlier, TPG's portfolio companies really represent sort of the breadth of global innovation. You represent, every aspect and every part of the business world. Can you talk a little bit about what TPG, how what TPG does can advance some of those goals around equality and equity?
When you look at what's happening in the world today, there is so much interest on the part of investors to think about kind of values-oriented investing, but investing really where they're generating impact, whether it's environmental, whether it's social. I mean, there are a number, financial inclusion, there are a number of different categories of things. So what we did is we began to outline and design the idea of the Rise Fund. And in doing that, what we did is we created a thesis that we could drive both financial returns as well as impact returns, and ultimately the two have to coexist. The two have to coexist in order to really create a perpetuation of companies that are focused on mission-based opportunities, but where they're really economically viable. And so we feel like it's a really important frontier for us to be leaders in. But that's as good an example of how we're mobilizing our franchise to create positive change, but also create real financial return that I can think of, really, frankly, as it relates to TPG.
Well, gentlemen, the things that we've talked about today, the scale of impact investing, the changing role of the CEO, it really is incredible how much evolution has taken place in leadership over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. I want to thank John and Doug for your leadership, and thank you for speaking with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Appreciate it.
Thank you all so much. And thank you for your leadership. Keep pushing. We need you. Now for our last, perhaps most important discussion, we zoom out to think about the American economy and how we can ensure a more equitable society as we recover, hopefully soon, from the COVID pandemic. Professor Sonal Shah and Dr. Betsy Stevenson are two of our nation's most esteemed economic thinkers. Both have dedicated their careers in government and academia to pushing for more inclusive economic and social policy. At All In Together, we want women to understand the critical role of public policy and political engagement in advancing goals of equity and inclusion. We hope this discussion inspires you to engage and push for policy that advances the common good. We are thrilled that Shamina Singh, president of the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, and the Executive Vice President of Sustainability at MasterCard will moderate this important and timely discussion. Shamina, welcome.
Thanks, Lauren. And thank you so much, Dr. Stevenson and Professor Shah, for joining us today for this very important conversation on building back an inclusive economy. Amidst the global pandemic and resulting economic downturn, vast inequalities between and within nations have been exacerbated, with increasing disparities in financial security and access to jobs and opportunities. It's clear that the economic systems of the past are not sufficient to support a future of inclusive growth, sustained prosperity, equal participation, and responsible stewardship. I think 2020 will go down in the history books as one of a great reckoning. The pandemic fundamentally upended our lives and laid bare our frayed social contract. But it also left us with a clear imperative. We cannot return to normal because normal wasn't good enough. So now begins the hard work of creating meaningful, lasting change. A vaccine will set us on the road to recovery, but a true recovery will take an unprecedented commitment from every sector and industry if we are to reimagine our economic system and society to be fair, just, and equitable. In short, we may need to redefine prosperity. Last year, the Center for Inclusive Growth led a collaborative exercise to define what an inclusive economy just might look like. But I think it's time we turn to the real experts on the panel today, Dr. Stevenson and Professor Shah, to share what they think. So let me open with a question to both of you. What should be the objectives that we should monitor in order to ensure recovery and an overall economy is more inclusive as we prepare to actually build back better? Why don't we start with you, Dr. Stevenson?
Great. I think that's such an important question. And I want to address a couple aspects of it. The first is to just start and talk about the economics, because people think somehow there is a juxtaposition between good economics and inclusivity. And that's not really right. In fact, a lack of inclusivity comes out of market failures. And so we know we've learned, I think, even more over the past 30 or 40 years that our economy doesn't quite function like that, the standard model you might have learned in your very first economics class. We teach this very simplified standard model so students can start to understand what economics is. But the real world is full of what economists call externalities, when my behavior is impacting you and you don't take that into account. And so you do what's really the wrong thing for the long run. And that basically describes climate change, the wrong thing, because you weren't taking into account a full set of costs and benefits. So I think for me, an inclusive economy is one that thinks through all the market failures, that takes externalities into account, that thinks about market power and the way market power can arise, and then the way it can distort. And I think that's going to be really important as we go forward, particularly coming out of the pandemic. We've seen increased market concentration as many small businesses have gone under, big businesses have gained market power, and that is going to reduce inclusivity. So we're going to have to address market power. Now I want to make one third point and then turn it over to Professor Shah, but that is to address this idea of meritocracy, or one in which everybody has equal opportunity. So I love this question of what does inclusivity mean for you? And I ask it actually at the beginning of my microeconomics for public policy class every year, because I say to my students, if you don't know the goal of your public policy, then how are you going to know whether your public policy is successful? So let's start by asking, what is inclusivity? What does success look like to you? And I always have a large number of students who really just point to that meritocratic answer, as long as everybody has an equal chance to get ahead. But the problem is that that's a really static way of thinking about the problem, because I can give everybody in a given generation the chance to get ahead. But as long as some people fell behind, they're going to be raising children that don't have the same opportunities as the other people who got ahead. And so we have this problem, which is very, very hard to create this vision of equality of opportunity whenever we have vast amounts of inequality. So you can't have dramatic inequality and then say, oh, but we're going to level the playing field, because you're never going to be able to convince very wealthy people who have a large share of resources that they should strip those resources away from their children, not give them every advantage they can, not take them traveling, not give them extra learning experiences. And so inequality begets inequality. So you really have to get at the root of inequality if you want to try to create something that's actually going to be inclusive for everyone and be meritocratic, actually create equality of opportunity.
So structural components are absolutely, I agree with you, play an important role here. Professor Shah, what's your take on this?
Yeah, first of all, Shamina, thank you for framing the conversation, and also kudos to your report that MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth put out on opportunities and sort of what you should be approaching. And I just want to build on Dr. Stevenson's comments, because I think what she has laid out is very much the macro picture we should be looking at, as well as the micro issues that I think we sometimes get lost in. And I think it requires us also, so there's the economic conversation, and then there's economics in everything else, healthcare and education and each of those pieces. So if you were to take everything Dr. Stevenson said and applied it in each of those sectors, whether it's in thinking about access to healthcare, who gets access, how do those resources get spread out, where do those resources get spent? It's important that we start looking at equality of opportunity, equity in all of those places, because it's easy to just think about it from the economic system, like we're going to make sure that the markets do X or Y, but not then go deep in each of these sections, right? How do we apply the economics to healthcare? How are we applying the economics to education? Who is going to public schools? How are they getting there? How are those resources allocated? Is the best way of doing it just the way we do it right now, which is property taxes? Is that the best way to be thinking about it? So when we think about equity, we need to go deep and really think through this, because this is a system that's been around for a very long time. If we're only going to make changes at the edges, we're not going to change the fundamental core pieces. One part of your paper was about equitable access. And let's just take finance, for example, right? We're like, let's fix the equity of access in finance. Well, it's like, fair, but then we have to go back and look at the root of some of those challenges when we think about how your credit scores are done. Well, initially credit scores were created to keep Black people out of the system. And so if we're going to now try to reform the credit score, but not recognize what the initial cause of that was, then we're not going to actually fix anything. We're just going to try to fix the edges of it and not really the root of the problem. So I think when we think about these questions about equity, when we think about these questions and everything Professor Stevenson said, we've got to go deep and not just do it on the surface, because we got to understand that, all of this meritocratic stuff that we talk about, we're going to build upon a system that is already unfair, and you're only going to change it along the edges. So if we want to address inequity, then let's go deep in addressing inequity.
Thank you for that. I want to stay a little bit on that tack. Dr. Stevenson, you have so many vantage points for this work. Academia, you're chief economist for the Labor Department. You've come at this from so many angles. Some of the criticisms of our economic system is that it tries to do too much. Like, it's efficient, but it's not resilient. It was made to generate jobs, but at the expense of dignity. You talked about the structural inequalities. But are these false dichotomies, or are we going to be able to actually get there? Can we create something that ensures growth and equity, that growth, it can be inclusive, or are we just, is it not real?
Oh, I think it's a completely false dichotomy. I think stronger, more sustainable growth is actually going to require inclusivity. I think we have gone, I want to say as far as we can on inequity, but actually the reality is we've gone as far as we have despite our inequities. And if you actually look around at what countries thrive, it actually takes inclusivity to thrive. The fundamental idea in economics is that people are driven by incentives. I believe that. That's why I'm an economist. People are driven by incentives, but we don't actually have to assume that they're selfish. We don't even think that they're always rational. We know that there are ways in which people systematically make mistakes. Economists have really been banging their head against a wall trying to understand discrimination for decades now, because they want to think about discrimination as somehow being the thing that's driving growth, and that's why it's sustainable, instead of understanding that it's feeding a psychological need, a set of norms, a structural way of looking at the world, and it's actually not helping growth at all. It's actually hurting it. And so I think that comes from realizing that when we say people pursue incentives, that doesn't mean that they're always looking at the financial bottom line. They are real human beings, and real human beings really are driven by feeling good. And unfortunately, sometimes what makes you feel good is bad. And we can change that. We can change how we see the world. We can change what motivates us. And if we do that in a way towards inclusivity, I think we get more rapid growth. And I'll just take one concrete but really small example. We know we have an enormous amount of research that says early childhood education is really important for being productive adults. And yet we have a lack of access to investment in children. We have a lack of access to investment in children at large parts of the income distribution. If we solve that problem, we will have people better able to grow up to make the kinds of decisions that will allow them to be more productive. I think it will put a fire under economic growth. And in fact, if you go back to the 20th century, we already know that what drove growth in the 20th century was inclusivity. We made high school free and publicly available to everyone. And the rest of Europe laughed at us. They said the kinds of things that you hear today about access to college, like, oh, not everybody needs to be a high school graduate. There are all these jobs where you don't need to know how to read or write. And in fact, we were like, no, we're going to take you all the way through 12th grade. And that's what made us the most productive country in the world in the 1950s and 1960s. So inclusivity drives higher, more rapid, faster growth.
It's interesting you should say that. Recently, Larry Fink, I guess, came out with his investor letter to CEOs. And Professor Shah, I want to turn it to you because you have actually been very much in the public, private, and social sectors and have created change wherever you've gone. What do you make of what can the private sector do? And does it start and end with investors, or should this be something that not only CEOs, but all of us are thinking about? Give us some answers. What should we be doing here?
The corporations have a huge opportunity right now to be leaders in this space. And they have been, in some cases, they've been doing it when you look at different movements and how companies have played a role in that. Imagine when corporations in just 3 areas I'll give. So for example, in procurement, can companies be buying from more women-led companies as well as from people of color-led companies? That in itself is a huge buying power, but you make the statement that these are companies that are growing. And when that happens, they then become the companies that we buy from and we think about and we talk about, but it requires making those investments. The other is leadership, making sure that diverse leadership, and we've seen this across many studies, that when there is diverse leadership at the top, the companies run well. And you're looking at risks differently, you're looking at opportunities differently, but there is study after study that has come out about this, and this is not something that needs more study. It's just actually been there that says when there is diverse leadership, companies do well. So making sure that there's leadership at the top that is diverse, whether it's in your C-suite, whether it's across your middle management, it doesn't need to be just in middle management or just in the C-suite. It needs to be across the company that there is diverse management, because that's how you think about this. And then the third is on the investment side. Where do you put your money? Where are you allocating your resources? What types of companies are you investing in? Do they have diverse leadership? Is their board membership diverse? Like, there's a way to be thinking about that. So there is an opportunity here for companies to, and it doesn't require government to regulate this. It requires companies to know that the data exists, the metrics are already out there. How do you make sure you do that? It is where impact investing started. It is the concept of ESG, making sure that you're managing companies for long-term growth. But what we know is inclusiveness leads to long-term growth, not just in the economy from a public policy perspective, but also in the economy from a corporate perspective, that inclusivity actually leads to growth, and that matters. And we need to, again, even in the private sector, get out of these false dichotomies that it's too hard to do or it doesn't matter, it's been growing anyway, but recognize that when we make these investments, the long-term outcomes are actually very good.
Thank you for that. Thank you both for those answers. I want to turn it a little bit to a different conversation. You know, what we measure matters. I mean, you wrote The Economist, and so all you look at are the numbers and the graphs and things like that. So GDP is sort of the standard measure for how we look at growth. Is that right or wrong? Professor Shaw, why don't you start?
Well, I worked for a candidate at Pete Buttigieg where we put out that GDP shouldn't be the only measure of growth. So I'm gonna start there. But listen, I think we can look at GDP broadly, but we've got to look at metrics across the board. So right now, you look at the current administration; they're looking at who's in senior leadership, where are they, what are we doing? But that requires us to look at metrics across the board. And as Dr. Stevenson had said, you know. The incentives matter. If I am not incenting you in a company to make sure that your board is diverse, then you're not going to make that decision because there's no incentive for you to change behavior, right? So what kinds of incentives are we putting in? What's fascinating to me, and I'm gonna sort of go off script here. What's fascinating to me is like the one place where if you came to me and I was running a company and you said, you know, I'm not going to meet my numbers this quarter, you're going to look at me and be like, what job are you in? Because the job is for you to make sure we have more clients, our revenues are increasing. Yet when it comes to diversity, we don't hold anyone accountable to those metrics. We're like, oh, we can't find the right number of people. Oh, we don't see enough people out there that can do that. And that is an okay answer for us to accept year on year after year. So 30 years later, we're still having this conversation that the pipeline doesn't exist. There's not enough CEOs. There's not enough people. If that is the metric we're setting, and if that is something, then we need to put real incentives behind those metrics. So it's about metrics, but it's about incentives. So making sure that when we talk about access to capital, that there are actually numbers of people who get access to capital. How many businesses of color actually got access to capital? Are we changing our policies to ensure that those businesses can get access? Which ones are missing out? Where did that money go? The PPP loan program is a great example right now that is going on in public policy. Are we making sure people of color are getting, and businesses of color are getting access to that capital, and making sure we're measuring to it, making sure we're reporting on it, making sure that those metrics are real, not just, oh, we made sure we reached out to, but that actually numbers of businesses of color got access to the PPP loans. Who were they? Where were they? In corporate boardrooms, are we sure that there are actually diversity of thought, diversity of people, diversity of color in corporate boardrooms? Because if not, then we're getting our bubbles and we're continuing to create these bubbles. So metrics matter. GDP alone is not the answer for where growth is happening. What we need to be looking at is much deeper in GDP. I mean, Dr. Stevenson is the labor economist. I mean, if we're not looking deep into our labor economy and where that growth is actually happening, then just because the stock market is doing well doesn't mean people are doing well. And we can have seen that in 2008. We've seen that in 2020. We have to make sure that people are also benefiting from this, not just the markets themselves. Markets are not reflective of where jobs are, where job numbers are. It's important that we recognize that.
Listen, thank you both. I think we could talk for obviously hours about these topics. I want to close with a couple of concrete examples that I can pull from my own experience at MasterCard with Center for Inclusive Growth. So we talked about things that private sector can do differently. I just want to put a plug in because MasterCard's largest shareholder is the MasterCard Foundation. So when MasterCard went public, it gave 12% of its stock to create an independent foundation. I wonder what would happen if other companies going private or public rather created their largest shareholder as a foundation. Would that change anything? The second thing I just want to say is, I think Sonal, you raised this earlier, this idea of looking at credit differently, that's just one example. But unless we're willing to actually take the steps of private sector companies who are in the space, or public sector government agencies to actually try to do these models. We have a project going one in Africa and one in India, where we're actually looking at how you can look at alternative forms of credit as proxy for, alternative forms of behavior as proxy for credit score. We're not the only ones doing that, but these are the types of experiments and the pilots that are going to be required to actually use an evidence base to change how things work. So I just want to thank you both so much for your time today and for sharing your experience with how we can indeed create a more inclusive recovery. So thanks again to Lauren and the team for hosting us all here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shamina.
Thank you. It's been great.
Thank you all so much for that fascinating conversation. And thank you for joining us for this remarkable set of discussions. I've learned so much from each of the incredible leaders we've heard from today, and I hope you did too. Thank you once again as well to all of our sponsors for making this program possible. Throughout 2021, AIT will be offering more extraordinary programs like this one with more amazing women. Be sure to register for our upcoming programs and follow us on social media. In March, we will meet and hear from the women scientists leading COVID vaccine development and delivery, and explore how women are leading the fight for health equity in our Women in Healthcare Equity Forum. And in April, don't miss our second Black Women Lead Forum, hosted by Donna Brazil, highlighting exceptional Black women leaders across America who are leading the fight for progress in business, politics, media, and the arts. We're proud of the inclusive, mobilizing work we do at All In Together. If you're interested in doing more to advance women's leadership in your community, stay connected to our programs and trainings. There are many ways to lead, and AIT is committed to ensuring you have the tools and resources to make an impact. Thank you, and we will see you again soon.